Good evening to you all, and a warm welcome to this year's Founders Lecture. Can I please remind you that this lecture is going to be recorded, and could I ask you please to put your mobile phones onto silent. This lecture was created in 2005 as part of the 450th anniversary celebrations of the founding of St. John's College in 1555 by Sir Thomas White. Although a celebration, the purpose of the lecture is also to explore and discuss the principles and ideas that underlie any aspects of higher education and our modern world. Tonight, it is incredibly apt and both an honour and a delight to welcome our own Professor Kate Nation to give this year's lecture. Kate is the Maggie Snowling Fellow in Psychology, and her lecture, as you can see, is entitled Becoming a Reader. Kate's interest in children's language and literacy development began with her DPhil research at the University of York, which explored factors influencing spelling development. On successful completion of her DPhil, she remained in York, working as a research fellow for 5 years, before being appointed lecturer in psychology there in 1999. She moved to Oxford in 2002 and was promoted to Professor of Experimental Psychology in 2006. And Kate is also a Fellow of the British Academy. Her research focuses on the psychology of language, and especially reading and its development. She is fascinated by how children learn to read words and comprehend text, and more generally, the relationship between spoken and written language. She also studies language and cognitive processes in children with developmental disorders that impact on language and literacy development, including language impairment, autism, and dyslexia. I have the pleasure of working with Kate as a trustee of the college, but also as our former provost for academic affairs. She is a font of information, not only simply about the college, but about the workings of the university, and has a deep understanding, care, and compassion for her students and her colleagues. There is so much more that I could say, but we're here to listen to Kate. And this evening, she will guide us through a child's journey from novice to expert as they learn to read. She will consider the cognitive and linguistic mechanism that drives literacy and its development, and review how becoming literate shapes children's lives, thinking, and feeling. In this National Year of Reading, she'll reflect on what it means to be a reader and why the current decline in reading needs to be taken seriously. I promise you we are in for a real treat. Kate, it's an honour and it's a pleasure to invite you to give this year's Founders Lecture. Would you please welcome Professor Kate Nation?
Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, everyone. And it's a real delight to be here. Any year it would be an honour and a privilege to give the Founders Lecture. But this year, as part of the National Year of Reading initiative and celebrations, it's a particularly special occasion. And with that in mind, I thought I'd start with some reflections of what I'd like you to, the take-home message today. And when I was thinking about this, I thought there's lots of take-home messages I can think about reading, but maybe the one I want to leave you with is the answer to the question of why I think I've got one of the best jobs in the world. Now, it's not because I'm a Fellow of St. John's College, although that's quite nice on a good day. And it's not even that I get to teach such wonderful students, and there's lovely students here, and welcome back some of psychology alumni as well. It's more that I get to think on a daily basis about a problem, about a set of situations, set of ideas that, when I was thinking about it, I've probably thought about nearly every day of my life since my third year undergraduate studies. And that's a long time ago. And the question that's fascinated me all these years is really how we can go from something on the left-hand side to something that looks like the right-hand side. What I decided to do for this lecture was to draw on photographs from my previous graduate students and other associates of St. John's College. And these were all people who've gone on to make their mark, and they were doing their own research on children's language and literacy. And I asked them to send me photographs of their own children reading. So all of the photographs that you're going to see today have a connection to the college in either the people or the situation. So you might recognise some familiar faces, you might recognise some family resemblances along the way. But the question we're going to think about is how we go from reading and being interested in print in the early school years through to this rather wonderful, nearly 18-year-old woman on the right-hand side. Now, passionate as I am about my research topic, I accept that not everybody in the room will share that passion. But children's reading is clearly, surely, an important topic for all of us. So let me start with some statistics. Reading at age 7 predicts all manner of life outcomes: employment, health, housing, wealth, and happiness. And according to the OECD, so the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, in the UK, 20% of young people leave school with reading below the baseline levels, the baseline proficiency levels that are required to participate in modern life, 20%. We also know that poor readers are overrepresented in categories such as NEET, not in employment, education and training, the criminal justice system, homeless on the streets and in mental health clinics. Now, it's important to remember these are population-level statistics. A child who struggles with learning to read doesn't necessarily have a bleak outcome, far from it. But nevertheless, these are important population-level data. And surely one of the most important things that a primary school teacher does is to teach children to read. So therefore, the concerns that we have at the moment, not just in the UK, but in other parts of the world as well, about potential declines in reading, as Sue said in the introduction, really need to be taken seriously. So let's start that conversation by thinking about what I'm going to talk about this evening. And we need to start with a definition of reading, particularly in this mixed audience where I'm aware there are people who really might study reading proper, and by that I mean literature and proper subjects like that, not cognitive psychology like me. William, you're laughing too loudly at that. So let's start with the definition of reading. I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I think of things in very sort of information processing terms. So here's a short little story, so let's have a read together. The hallway held its breath. Fluorescent lights hummed, too loud, as his hand closed around the knife's cold handle, still sheathed in shadow. At the door, he paused. On the other side, a jobber waited. Soprano's pulse quickened, but then calmed. It wasn't his first time. He took a breath, then brought the blade down, decisive and sure. So this illustrates quite a few powerful things about what we do as we read. First of all, we're recognising the words clearly. We're getting to the language on the page via the print. There's also things that we're doing to sort of fathom the meaning, and lots of that is about inferencing. I think most of us here would get to the conclusion that this might be something about Tony Soprano. We might have, like me, binge-watched 9 box sets of The Sopranos some years back. So Tony Soprano presumably is going to go in and do what Tony Soprano does. We've got a sense of suspense building, and we also got things like he, and we imagine that he refers to soprano and that the knife's cold handle relates to the blade, and so on. We're making these inferences, we're making these connections in the text. Let me just change a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the pronouns. This sort of disturbs us a little bit in 2 ways. One, because we might have made the inference that it's stories about Tony Soprano, and then Tony Soprano isn't a she, so then we may be thinking his mother, his daughter, who might this be? And I guess it also sort of contradicts what we might think about women and knife crime, given that's what we imagined the story was going to be about. So let me make one more change. So here, the whole attitude, I hope, the whole attitude about the story has changed, because now it's not about a gangster about to go through the other side of the door and do a certain type of job. It's a completely different thing. So I hope, at least for people who know Sue Black, otherwise that joke didn't work at all. So that tells us straight away, I hope, that reading comprehension is complex. And that's something we can feel. We only need to spend a few minutes thinking about reading and we can come to that conclusion. And there is so much data that points to reading being a complex cognitive act. Some of that might come from eye movement studies, where we can monitor the eye movements as people as they read texts like the one that we've just seen. And for the patterns of eye movements, how they move their eyes forward and backwards, pause for longer on some words than other words, we can, as scientists, make inferences about the cognitive processes that are supporting reading. One thing that's amazing about reading is that skilled readers, we read really, really quickly. Depending on what we read, obviously, if it's difficult text, we spend a bit longer, but somewhere between 250 and 400 words per minute. That's faster than we speak. So we are reading and understanding written text faster than we process spoken language. In terms of thinking about the sort of language things that are involved in reading, as I've already said, obviously reading words, recognising those visual word forms is the front door to reading. If you can't do that, you can't get further. But clearly that in itself is only necessary but not sufficient to construct meaning. We need to access vocabulary, the right meaning of words. We need to use our grammatical skills and syntax to pull ideas together. Importantly, we need to link with the background knowledge and what we know about the world, about Tony Soprano or Sue Black. And this is a cognitive act, and a very active cognitive act. We have to construct meaning as we go along, we update it in the light of new information, and we're constantly inferencing to make sense of the world. So the two take-home messages from that first little introduction chapter to the talk is that reading is complex. It really is a highly complex act, even when we're talking about a short story, let alone a complex text about, I don't know, nuclear physics or a complex literary novel. And reading is very active. It's an orchestrated product. We've got lots of things going on in our brains as we try and make sense of written text. So this, of course, leads us to the question, how on earth do children learn to do this massive cognitive act? So let's think about that, first of all, in terms of learning to read words. Okay, so I'm just thinking about the bit that I had in red in the previous slide, the entry point into the reading system. I think here it's interesting to think about the sort of parallels between evolutionary time in terms of civilization and developmental time in terms of an individual child. So historically then we can think back to millennia and think about the strong oracy tradition that characterises humans, the sort of tropes, round the campfire telling stories and sharing information via speaking and listening. At some point, not that long ago in history, people made incredible inventions, the best inventions known to humankind, with the development of writing systems. And writing systems are artificial. Somebody made them up. And they've, like other things that exist, they stand the test of time or they die away. And writing systems have certainly stood the test of time. In terms of children, we can think of, like I say, this parallel with developmental time, that young children, they're born with the capacity to do early language, speaking and listening, and to communicate. This is something that kids don't need to be actively taught. It just emerges in childhood, in those preschool years. So the oracy tradition is there in us as well. The onset of literacy, though, is something different, because the onset of literacy, learning to read, is an unnatural act in the same way that a writing system is unnatural compared with the oracy tradition. So you can think about those two parallels there. And how I like to think about and conceptualise reading is via this sort of arrow here, that we have something that is the writing system, different writing systems of the world. I'm going to talk about English today, but it would be true for whatever writing system it is that we're thinking about. And the job of learning to read is to get the characteristics of the writing system that you happen to be growing up with into the head of the reader. So the writing system into the evolving reading system in the child's mind. And that's what I'm going to invite you to think about for the next few minutes. To help us on our way, we need a few more definitions, and we also need some help from Giles St John's Lamb, who I'm happy to see from the college Instagram account is back in the library where he belongs in Trinity term after spending the Easter vacation on some grand tour of North America with the president and the principal bursar. So Giles St John's Lamb. So let's use Giles, the word Giles, to illustrate some key terms. So let's think about semantics, the term to do with meaning. So we can think of here that the semantics of Giles is everything you know about Giles. He's a lamb. He's just come back from North America. Whatever it is we want to say about this specific lamb, or indeed any other type of lamb. We can also think about the phonology of the word Giles, the phonological form, and that might be the word form, Giles, or it might be the little sounds that combine together to make up the word Giles. Then we've also got the orthography, the spelling of the word Giles, the conventional spelling of Giles in English, Giles. So that's a little bit of terminology which takes us to this theoretical framework. So this is called, or it's become known over the years as the triangle model. It's actually a computational model devised in the mid to late 80s, and really with the sort of thinking that has become so foundational to the development of AI. So this is a neural network model that is implemented and computational, but it also works as a verbal theory, and I'm going to be talking about it in terms of a verbal theory today. So the idea behind this type of thinking is that we can put those little bits of information that we know about Giles, or indeed anything else in the world, into this connected network of representations. So we would have semantic things up there, we'd have orthography to do with the letter forms, and then we'd have phonology to do with the sounds of the word down there. So we've got units or sets of units of information about which represent what we know about those words. And then we've also got these connections or mappings between these different levels of representation. And let's spend a moment or two thinking about the nature of those mappings. So first of all, the mappings between phonology and semantics. So this is between the sound of the word Giles, the phonological form of the word Giles, and little Giles there. Now, what's interesting about these mappings, two things to note. First of all is that they're arbitrary, or at least somewhat arbitrary, in that there's nothing about the sound of the word Giles that associates it with the meaning of the word Giles. They just are. Giles is Giles. Okay? The other thing to note about these phonology semantics mappings is that this is what spoken language is about. So when children are beginning to speak and understand language in the preschool years, it's all about these mappings between phonology and semantics. So that system is already well underway in terms of development, well before kids ever learn to read. We can also think about the mappings between spelling and meaning. So something about those letters on the page that might map directly to the meaning, from Giles to the lamb. I'll come back to those a little bit later on in the talk. And then we've also got these mappings here between orthography and phonology, between the letters and the sounds that those letters make, or the sounds and the letters that represent those sounds. And what's interesting about these mappings is that they are, in an alphabetic system anyway, is that they are systematic, they are predictable. So in other words, something about the sound of the word tells you about its spelling. Something about the spelling of the word tells you about its sound. Now, in English, of course, they're only quasi-regular. There's lots of exceptions that we can point to. Again, I'll come back to that in a moment. But they're much more systematic, certainly compared with the mappings between semantics and phonology. We might not get to the right spelling or absolutely accurate pronunciation, but we can get a good way there. So that's the sort of grounding of the triangle model. And let's think about how reading might happen in the triangle model. So essentially, there's sort of two ways to read. I wouldn't want to give the impression that these are two distinct, completely different routines that are happening when we read. But broadly, we can think about these two different pathways that can support getting from the print to the meaning. We could have one type of pathway that goes from the orthography to the phonology to the semantics. So broadly, you see the letters, you sound those letters out. Having sounded those letters out, you can then get to the meaning of the word. So you'd have blend it together and you get to the meaning of cat. So from letters to sounds to meaning. We can also read words, though, by something that's much more direct between orthography and semantics. And if you need any convincing of this, think of the word sail and the word sail. We've got sail is in the sailing boat and sail is in the market sail. There's nothing in the phonology of those words that would distinguish them. They're distinguished by their spelling, and those spelling patterns relate to different meanings. Yet we know the meaning of the word sail by seeing it written down without any other context at all. So something about that orthographic form takes us to the right interpretation of sail. So the inference from that is that there's something going on in this green pathway. There's computational evidence for everything that I've said there. There's also behavioural evidence and lots of behavioural studies. And people have also made connections between these types of patterns in behaviour and the sorts of neural systems that support reading. And again, I'm not going to talk about this in detail today, but just to note that the action in word recognition, visual word recognition, starts back here at the left temporal occipital corpus area that's called or become known as the visual word form area. This feeds information into the towards the front of the brain, and we can go via two different types of functional pathways. One which seems to be something a bit more like O to P to S, and one that's a little bit more direct, going from the print into the language areas. So something about dorsal reading and ventral reading for those of you who know your brain anatomy. So this is the story for skilled readers. And as I say, good evidence from behavioural studies, computational studies, and for those who are interested in terms of the cognitive neuroscience of reading. When we think about children, maybe a prediction we'd start with is they just start with like a mini-me version of this. It's the same thing, but it just starts off a bit rubbish and it has to get a little bit better. But it turns out that that's the wrong way to characterise learning to read. And it's a style of thinking about learning to read that I think has probably got us into difficulties over the years in the classroom. So let me explain a little bit more about why I think that. And this, first of all, takes me to this lovely piece of art that one of my former students, Nina Tamura, made for me. Apparently, I used to say this a lot. I didn't realise I said it a lot, but I clearly did because it's now a poster in my study. It all begins with the alphabet. And that's because something really fundamental has to happen when kids are 5, 6, whatever age they are when they start to read. They need to get what's being referred to as the alphabetic principle. And again, this is for languages like English that work in an alphabetic system. And the alphabetic principle can be defined as this sort of fundamental insight. It's almost like a penny dropping type insight that these letters in the alphabet work together in systematic ways to build these connections between orthography and semantics. They're not paired associate learning, they're not direct links, there's something that's predictable and systematic. And this principle lies at the foundation of decoding. And decoding is this way of reading where we go from left to right, sounding the word out, blending it together and get into a pronunciation after a bit of an effort, and then from that pronunciation on to meaning. So I'm just going to show a video, hopefully if it works, which really illustrates for me both the joy of reading and the joy of getting it wrong, but also the fundamental properties of the alphabetic principle. So let's give this a go. So, as I say, all alphabet, no principle there. Right. Okay, so let's go back to our little triangle model. So we've got there the alphabetic principle and the decoding not working. The red route isn't happening quite yet. Of course, what's happening as kids are learning to read and as they're being taught is the alphabetic principle kicking in, and children are beginning to learn or beginning to acquire what I've referred to here as phonic knowledge. They're getting the notion of how their alphabet works. This is so important, and I've underlined a few key terms here to remind me to describe them. So one, this allows a system that generalises. Imagine if we were just learning Giles as Giles via some orthography semantic mapping. We could do that, but that wouldn't help us when we come to read the next word that we've not seen before. The joy of the alphabetic principle and the way the alphabetic system works is that learning how to read cat as cat means that when we come across another word, bat, hat, cap, we're already part way there in terms of understanding how to deal with those words. It's a generalizable system. Acquiring phonic knowledge is difficult, and it's worth sort of thinking about why it's difficult. English gets a bad name because of our irregular writing system. Again, we'll have some examples in a moment. I think that's slightly unfair because this is difficult in all alphabetic languages to some extent. It's difficult for a number of reasons. First one I would refer to as a sort of segmentation problem. So last week I was in Porto in Portugal, and I had the experience, I'm sure many of you have had, of sitting in a cafe in a foreign country in a language system that you don't know, and you can hear people talking. You have no idea what they're saying. And more than not knowing what people are saying, you have no idea where the words are. It's just some continuous stream of sound, and you don't even know where to break the words up, let alone find the little sounds within a word. And that will be true for all languages that we're not familiar with. The other is a sort of ambiguity type problem. So obviously we all sound different from one another. We might have different dialects. Also, the way that we pronounce the same sound will be realised very differently in different words. So for all of us, if we say quietly the word spit and the word pit, the p sound in those two words will sound quite different. Yet we have to learn to hear them as the same and categorise them with the same letter. And again, that will be true for all languages. It isn't just an English problem. The problem is even bigger for English, of course, because we do have these irregularities. So It's difficult and it needs instruction. All the hours in the world in a library, kids are not going to, very rarely will kids fathom this out for themselves. And we know from lots of evidence that it's best achieved via direct instruction that's sort of systematic, that helps children along in some systematic, programmatic way. And this is the sort of teaching regime that many of you will have heard of, the phonics teaching, and the idea that you can teach phonic rules or how letters and sounds go together in this systematic way and give opportunities for the children to practice by presenting them with little books to read that are phonically controlled. They're sometimes called decodables. And these are books that are made up of words that contain the letter sound sequences that they've been taught. So then they have an opportunity to practice and also to experience the sense of being a reader. And this is really important to get things going. Think of it as a starter kit. It's your sort of sourdough starter kit to establish a habit of decoding. It most definitely isn't word reading, and it most definitely isn't reading in a bigger sense. This is some distance away from the soprano story that we started with, but it's an essential foundation to get the whole system going. Weirdly, in education, the notion of phonic teaching and direct instruction in phonics has been part of a sort of pedagogical, philosophical, political battle over the years, where pendulums have swung in one direction or another, which is rather puzzling, really, but that's how it is. A few years ago, if you're interested in reading a bit more about this, together with my colleagues Anne Castle and Cathy Russell, we tried to bring together the evidence about this in a sort of readable, accessible way. The paper's there if people want to take a look. And I think the two sort of take-home messages about phonics instruction, for me, I've got the microphone so you can hear what I think about it, is that the evidence is pretty clear that this is important, it's teachable, and most kids will respond well to phonic instruction. But, and the but is, there's two buts. One is that phonics has to happen in a sea of broader, or an ocean of broader language experience. And again, we'll come to this a little bit later on. But there's no reason why that can't happen. Children can be learning about acquiring phonic knowledge. That bit's non-negotiable. They have to get the phonic knowledge in if they're going to have a reading system that generalises. And they can learn to do this through a phonics instruction at the same time as they're having rich language experience with proper books by being read to and by experiencing story. So that's one thing about reading where the evidence is really quite clear. I think that language is important and phonics is sort of a little bit separate from that, and then hopefully things will come together later in development. I think where the questions remain about phonics is about how many different letter sound correspondences get taught, how long do you keep with these decodable books, and so on. And those are empirical questions, and unfortunately science hasn't really got to the bottom of answers to those questions yet to help teachers in the classroom. So phonics is necessary but not sufficient. I think that is an uncontroversial statement to make. I don't know. It seems uncontroversial to me. But as I say, it's not even word reading proper. It's about, this phonological decoding. It's the starter kit. So then you think, well, what else has to happen? And what has to happen really in some ways is quite boring. Much of psychology seems to be stating the obvious, and this is going to be one of those things, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you it's a little bit more interesting than it first sounds. Because essentially the answer to the question is practice and experience, okay? And we can think about practice and experience in several different ways. So one way we can think about experience is literally just practicing it, like getting on your bike and practicing away, or going to the gym and building your biceps, whatever it might be. Practice is important to hone those basic skills, to make them more automatic and to make them more fluent. That's part of the answer to the question. More interesting, I think, though, is what experience brings the child in addition to this sort of, rote practice or something. And this is the opportunity to experience print. And by experiencing print and exposure to these systematic regularities that are in the writing system, the child can then begin to build their reading system in the light of that. And this takes us to a concept that's really important in many areas of psychology, including language learning, sometimes referred to as statistical learning. Sometimes people talk about implicit learning. My preference is just to call it learning. And let me give some examples away from language to sort of highlight what I mean by this notion of implicit statistical type learning. So this is somebody else's experiment, and the simple task is two faces flash up on the computer screen for I know, 500 milliseconds a second or something. And the task is really straightforward. All the adult has to do is to make a discrimination. Is this the same monkey or is it a different monkey? Yes, no decision. For most of us, that's actually quite challenging, unless we are particularly interested in monkey faces. We go backwards and forwards, and people are really slow to make these decisions, and they also make quite a lot of errors. It's difficult. If we change the stimuli to 2 human faces, though, for most of us this becomes utterly trivial, and it's really easy to make the discrimination that these faces belong to different identities. So adults find it much harder to discriminate between monkey faces than human faces. As it turns out, 9-month-old babies show exactly the same effect. If we go a little bit younger, though, 6-month-olds, it turns out that 6-month-olds beat us on this task. So your average 6-month-old finds it equally easy or equally difficult to discriminate human faces as it does to discriminate between 2 monkey faces. And the idea here is then that there's something about their visual system, their perceptual system, the way that they process information hasn't yet become tuned or optimally adapted to the environment that they're growing up in. When humans are growing up, we need to be able to distinguish between human faces. That's a fairly useful thing to be able to do. We don't really need to distinguish between monkey faces, and so our systems become specialised for what it is that we're wanting to process. And so 6-month-olds are still on that journey. By 9 months of age, we're already seeing that functional specialisation in the system. This is reversible. You could, sit in front of monkey faces day after day after day, and we would get better at recognising them, or discriminating them, I should say. But that obviously gets harder the older we get. Another example, as we head towards the wine reception, is thinking about wine tasting. The first time we have a glass of red wine, and another glass of red wine, and another glass of red wine, they all taste the same, they're sort of red wine-like. But the more we drink, the more we practice, the more we experience variations, and we begin to then categorise those variations into different categories. Different types of grape, different types of body, and so on, and we become expert. We become very expert at wine drinking. And so be it for language. So language, it's a complex system, hugely complex, but it's a system that contains a lot of correlations, a lot of probabilistic information that's correlated with each other and all across different levels as well. So probabilistic relationships between multiple levels of correlated features is how I've described it here. I'm just going to give 2 examples. I could give loads. Linguists here could give very many more. So take a probabilistic relationship in terms of sounds of words. So if you take the ng sound at the end of a word like sing, in English, this doesn't occur at the start of words. It just doesn't. It could, but it doesn't. So that means if we're hearing ng in a stream of continuous speech, that tells us something about, well, this is possibly the end of a syllable or the end of a word. It's a word boundary, a cue to word boundary. We've also got regularities or predictable features in terms of word meaning here. So we've got the word ground, which can be a noun, or an adjective. So we've got ambiguity in vocabulary. But if we're referring to the floor sense of the word, then in natural language, that tends to co-occur with a word like fell. So we get some clues to the meaning in the system there, sort of built in. The adjective sense would tend to co-occur with a word like coffee. So again, we've got these predictable, probabilistic relationships between episodes. Like I say, many, many more of those, but let me turn to a couple which are really important for helping us think about becoming expert at reading. The first example is to do with refining and enriching those orthographic mappings. And this is where it's a joy to be working, researching the English language, because we've got we're not short of stimuli. So let's take an example. So we've got the word spook. Now, do we think of spook as an exception word, something a bit weird, because of book and look? Or is it rule governed because of words like spook and spool? Which way do we want to play this? Consider the grapheme, so the letter sequence EA, as in beat, head, stake. We've got a problem here. We've got the same letters. We've got completely different renditions of those letters. But there's probabilistic information that we know as skilled readers. We might not know that we know it, but we do know it because we use it every time we read or write these words. So overall, across all the words in our language, E is the most common pronunciation. But that is conditioned, that's relative to other things that are going on as well. So it's conditioned by the final letter. So if the final letter's T, then EE is the most common. Is the most common. If the final letter's D, then E is the most common. So already that EA pronunciation is not as ambiguous as we once thought. It's not absolute, it's not perfect, there's variation between words. More interestingly for me, there's also variation within individuals. How would you pronounce the word steet and gred? I find myself pronouncing these differently on different occasions, and there's interesting reasons as to why we might have that flexibility. Also, how would you spell a new phonological word? So let me say a new phonological form, the word prabe, for example, which I imagine most of you haven't thought about spelling before. You can spell it all of these different ways. How you choose to spell it will be a consequence of your own statistics, your own probabilistic mappings between how letters and sounds should work together. So all this irregularity might take us to this sort of famous example, which I think is attributed to George Bernard Shaw. I don't know if it was originally him, but this idea, this spelling system in English is absolutely nonsense. We need to get rid of it. Go to fish, with the idea that GH could be as in tough, O could be as in woman, and TI as could be in motion. And therefore, this is nonsense in the spelling system and we need to reform. And this is wrong, of course. It's wrong for the reasons that I've just said, in that there are systematic regularities there in the system. And it's also wrong because English has also other forms of regularities to do with morphology. So English is what's called a morphophonemic language. And we have these systematic relationships in the writing system that tell us about meaning in different types of ways. So let me give some examples. So here we've got book, bookworm, and bookish. Knowing book here tells us something about the other words. Kind, kindness, unkind, kindly, kindness, shyness, darkness. We've got systematicity again. These lovely examples from the English past tense. In spoken language, we're in a real pickle here because we've got heard, kicked, snored. They all sound different at the end. We've got tut sounds, ud sounds, all sorts of different things going on there. Happily, in spelling, they've all got the same spelling. So something about the ED at the end of the word is a cue to this being a past tense form. And it's extraordinary that there's only 38 words in our language that have ED at the end that are not past tense forms. So we've got words like bed and shed and wicked and moped. But most of the time we see an ED at the end of the word, it tells us it is a past tense form. I'll skip over that example to save some time. We've also got these lovely things like the G in signature tells us something about sign, where there's no G sound, gut sound, but it's there in the writing. And magician, magic, for example. So the way that we can think about reading, and again, lots of evidence for this that I'm not going to have time to talk about, but the way to think about how we go from this sort of sequential decoding to something that's more expert, more flexible, more nuanced, more automatic, is to think about what the children are doing. And basically, they're acting as little statisticians. They're being exposed to all these statistical regularities via reading experience, via connecting with print. And from that, they're beginning to form their own little data set about how the language works. Just like we form a data set about, the distance between eyes and noses or whatever to help us discriminate faces. And by thinking of things this way, we can sort of put the different figures together that I've shown so far. We've got reading experience, so practicing, reading lots and lots of different texts. We've got some theoretical model that helps us understand things about learning, memory, perception, how they act on that statistical input. Those two things come together, and then we've got a reading system that it's doing its thing in its brain. In the brains, they're finding regularities and being able to become expert. So we can think then about a reading system that becomes fast, efficient, automatic, and flexible. And that's one that gets us from print to meaning with minimum effort. That's what we want. We don't want to spend ages trying to work out what the print is telling us. We want the print to get us into the language system, into the story, into the text as soon as we can. For skilled readers, that generally means it's the green route that's operating, that's winning the horse race. We go from print to meaning very quickly without this need for some sort of phonological recoding process. But we can do it. We can do that if we need to. But becoming expert is about developing that green routine. If you're interested in some of the evidence that backs up what I've just been describing there, again, I've got another little review paper there that I'm very happy to share with people. But to conclude the chapter 2 section of the talk, where we've been thinking about learning to read words, we've talked about the importance of the starter kit, the phonics instruction, and then after that, I think the answer to becoming expert is boring in one sense because it's practice and experience, but I hope I've given you a feel for why thinking about experience isn't boring. It's telling us something pretty fundamental about how learning and memory happens. I should also at this point share some other pictures from former students and colleagues, because this is a reminder to talk about the importance of instruction. I've already mentioned the importance of instruction for phonics. I think where maybe there are gaps in the education system in the UK at the moment is that we're not really helping teachers support copious reading experience. It can happen passively. Kids can just read and they pick up all this stuff. But they also need opportunities. They need rich text. They need good quality books. They need classroom time. And they need classroom time that allows teachers to do what they want to do, which is to teach reading, scaffolding, supporting reading, providing challenging texts, modelling and scaffolding, all those things that can help the statistics acquire a pace. And I think that's perhaps somewhere where there's a little bit of a gap in our education system at the moment, but maybe one for discussion over wine. So let me get to the final section of the talk, and that sort of leads into these every year reading thoughts. The uses of literacy is how I've described this. So I'm going to jump over that. So if we're going to take reading experience seriously, I think it's important for us to understand a little bit more and look a little bit more closely about what reading experience looks like for children. So I just want to introduce a theme of our research over recent years. This is with Yarling and Yang Shao and Nikki Dawson, who are here, and I think Nilanjana is here, might be here. She's from Oxford University Press Children's Dictionaries. And what we've been doing in this work is really trying to use sort of a big data approach to help us understand reading experience. And the little bit I'm going to talk about today comes from work where we've compared the nature of the statistics, the nature of the language input children experience from child-directed speech, so the language that they hear in the home, so that's the spoken language they're hearing, with the language that they experience if they're reading or being read to. Okay, we've also looked at their own writing, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So this is direct comparisons over tens of thousands of books or tens of thousands of conversations, millions and millions of words to try and discover patterns. If we can discover patterns in the input, in the language, and those are things that children might be learning and acquiring through their own experience. And this takes us to a concept that I've been calling book language. So book language, it's obviously the substrates, the words, the substrate, the context that they're experienced in. Fundamentally, as we've already said, books have orthography, whereas conversations don't. But there's also other aspects of book language which are quite distinct to day-to-day conversational language. So one thing that seems to be quite important is that book language, or I think it's quite important, is that book language is more lexically diverse. So I couldn't get through the talk without showing at least one data slide, so this is it. And this is a linguist will recognise as a type token figure. So how it works is we've got types on the y-axis, we've got tokens on the x-axis. So think of a type and token this way, in the way the figure works. We put all of the words from spoken language, all of the words from the children's book into big hats, and then we put in our hand and we'll pull out 100 words from the book corpus. So there we've got 100 tokens, 100 different words, 100 tokens. But they might all be the same word. We might have been very unlucky and just pulled out the 100 times. So that's a token frequency of 100, but a type frequency of 1. There's only one type, the. Okay, so that's how type token works. And then what we've done here is plotted that separately for the picture books aimed at preschoolers and the spoken language that preschoolers experience through child-directed speech. And what this figure is telling us that is when we pull out 1,000 words, 20,000 words, 50,000 words, however many words we pull out, there are more different words in the picture books than in spoken language, than in the conversational language they're experiencing in the home. So there are more words in books and more different words. That's what I mean by more diversity. Then if we look at the nature of those words, we also see differences. So book language words, they are denser, they're more sophisticated, they're more complex, they're more abstract, they're more emotionally arousing. We've also shown that children's book language is more syntactically complex. So something like relative clauses are vanishingly rare in conversational language. To the extent that children experience relative clauses, they're experiencing them through reading or being read to. So what this body of work tells us is that children who read more, or children who are read to more, they experience different language. It's quantitatively different, but it's also qualitatively different for the language that they get for free, say, in the home. And if we take this statistical learning approach, this means that they have different opportunities for learning because their learning mechanisms are operating across different types of language. So you might then think, well, why is it the case that books are like this and spoken language is like that? So let me give you an example of why, well, hopefully that brings home why these differences might be there. They're not accidental. So these are some of Nikki's data. And what she's done here, again, picture books aimed at preschool children. On the left-hand side, we've got words that occur in the books but don't occur in the conversations. And on the right-hand side, vice versa, words that appear in conversations but don't appear in the books. Just want to highlight these words here. Shriek, gasp, mutter, whisper, shout, yell. Quite difficult words. They occur in reading, and they occur in reading more often than in speech for good reason. When we're speaking to each other, when we're waving our arms around, when we're using our tone of voice and facial expressions, we don't need to be clever with language because it's obvious what type of saying we're doing. We can just say said, said, said. Whereas in reading, there's none of this shared situation. Instead, the text itself has to create the shared situation. So what the writer wants is activated in the reader's mind. So it matters what sort of saying. Is the character shrieking? Are they muttering? Are they gasping? Are they whispering? Said isn't good enough. We need something that's more precise. So hopefully that gives you an example of why book language is different to conversational language. This is something that sociolinguistics have known for a long time, and I think it's something that has been under-recognised in my field of thinking about children's reading development, but it's sort of obvious when you think about it. Writing systems have evolved off a code. This is amazing. Writing systems are amazing because they allow us to represent information across space and time. We can write it down so that someone thousands of years later who knows nothing about us can read it if they wish to do so. But because of this decontextualization, if you like, written language has a difficult job to do. It needs to be crafted carefully so that the intended meaning is into the text so that it can be recreated in the reader's mind. And because of that, vocabulary is different. Words are more complicated, different types of words, different feels of words, and different types of syntax. That feeds into this idea of academic language, so the idea of thinking, reasoning, expository texts, non-fiction texts, academic language, a use of language in a formal way to explain, to educate, to teach. It's hard to imagine some of the things that our students are learning here in philosophy or whatever. To learn that through an oral tradition, it's possible, but the written word arguably does it better. I'm not going to talk about that. Final few minutes of the talk, I'm going to carry on the theme of thinking about story and children's reading. And this takes us not into exploratory text, but into narrative text, fiction, and the idea that by reading, we learn about all these, statistics about the writing system, but stories are also teaching us about people and teaching us about ourselves. I'm just going to do a little pause here for a moment because I call this book language. I like the term book language. But of course, it isn't book language, really. It's narrative language is what I'm going to be talking about. And narrative structure can happen in songs, poems, in TV shows, in all sorts of ways. It doesn't have to be written language. I think written language is important. I'll come on to that in a moment. But I just wanted to pause here for a moment to say what I'm really talking about is story. And story in our culture, until recently, has been well represented by the book and written language, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so this is a good opportunity to pause my voice for a second and just share with you a video from the Story Museum, whose work really, really makes clear the importance of story, and then we'll come back to reading.
Stories live with you all your life. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Einstein said, no problem can be solved with the same mindset that created it. Who are the ones who are going to come up with some of the solutions? The children. We need to take children seriously, fast.
Oxford really is a city of stories, but it's a city of great contrasts as well. We have one of the most important universities in the world, but we also have some of the lowest levels of deprivation in the UK. 1 in 6 children in Oxford live in poverty.
The attainment gap between children, even before they start school, has been getting wider and wider.
For many of the schools we're working with, more than 50% of their children qualify for pupil premium. So much of what they're doing, particularly when they're young, is building blocks for literacy learning.
Every child should be given the same chance in life. So this has to be addressed urgently.
Stories are not a luxury, they're an absolute essential. We welcome many groups each week to the Story Museum and offer incredible opportunities to young people. The workshops that we organise here are transformative on young people's lives to really explore the power of stories.
Research shows that if children read for pleasure, their life chances are increased enormously.
The benefits of stories are absolutely enormous. They're, I think, the most important thing that we can do for small children. It's completely unlimited power.
The Story Museum was able to offer a huge range of support programmes, from story play sessions with the very smallest children through to writing workshops for young teenagers to support their GCSEs, to teacher development programmes.
I think it's a wonderful resource for us. Children love stories. It's such an important part of understanding the world around them and understanding themselves. So we not only use stories to improve literacy, but actually we use stories to improve children's emotional well-being.
This is a joyful space. Somewhere like this is all about the fun. And that's a really important message. And a child, their whole educational and reading journey can be transformed just by suddenly realising, oh, books are fun.
The mission of the Story Museum is to transform young lives through the power of stories. And I've actually seen that very viscerally. I don't think many institutions have that power.
Stories. They are transformative magic.
So the Story Museum, you don't have to be a child to go there. We go there for a bedtime story on the giant bed there. And know when you go there as a paying customer, you can all go there and take your children as a paying customer, but there's also the most amazing access and outreach programme that is more than a rival for our own Inspire programme, which of course we're very proud of and should be proud of, working in connected ways and sustained ways with those 50% of kids in Oxford who are not ready when they go to school. Amazing work, so do yourself a favour and get yourself there. And this is also an opportunity to say this is the sort of thing that can happen to support children's language and literacy growth while they're doing their phonics. They can do their phonics, which might be a constrained set of learning, in the context of all the wonderful things that Story have to offer. But I'm going to finish the lecture by trying to connect those ideas and going back to reading, because I'm a reading person. And I think written language is special. It's a vehicle for stories, but I also think it's the driver of something that's important as well. So ChatGTP drew me this rather nice picture of a car full of books to illustrate what I mean by this. And I also think it's important to think about reading this way, because as much as we love stories, and for little kids who are it is all about the fun and it is all about that sort of sharing. For those of us who are natural introverts, it's a bit like going to an HR thing, and they ask you to do role play, and you're like, oh my God, no, thank you. But what we do like to do, we lose ourselves in books. We find ourselves in books. And again, these lovely pictures from former colleagues where we've got two people really connected, a father and a daughter, but they're with lost in their own books. And this boy doing the only sensible thing one can do at a family wedding, which is to pull out a book. And that, again, this is where the text has to create the story. We don't have the Story Museum storytellers there to make it magical. The language has to make it magical. So let's return to this idea introduced into the video about books being important for emotional development and well-being. This rather lovely cartoon here from Chris Laddell. Reading allows us to see and understand the world through the eyes of others. A good book is an empathy engine. This makes sense. What's the evidence for it? Well, the evidence for it I don't think is satisfactory enough yet. I feel it, but I'm not persuaded by all of the evidence that's cited in support of it. Now, when we look at the literature, and this is from adult reading, so people like us, if we filled in questionnaires about how much we read and how much we enjoy reading, and then we did, some experiment where our emotion recognition was measured or something, there'd be a correlation between those two things. And from that, people have made conclusions about there being a relationship between fiction reading and literary reading, actually, to, how much people do of that and how empathic they are, how much good social cognition that they've got. This mainly draws from correlational data. The attempts to try and get causal evidence there is not very satisfactory. That said, the evidence from the correlational studies replicates. It's been shown across several meta-analyses now. The effects are really small. Thankfully, they're really small, but they are reliable and they're certainly intriguing. The type of explanation that's given for this sort of correlation goes something like this, that via reading fiction, we're sort of transported, is a word that's used. When we're transported, as the little boy at the wedding there, that gives us an opportunity to simulate, to practice our skills. By practicing, by simulating, we gain social knowledge, and we also get to to practice our operation of social knowledge. This seems fine, this seems reasonable. But it's very much situated in the social world of the child, and I think what I want to try and do is to bring this back into the language world of the child. So again, I'm going to tie this back to the book language ideas. So think of an emotion like anger. We have an arousal state, which is anger. We all know what anger is. When we're looking at someone who's angry, or when we're trying to represent it by an emoji, we've got a whole range of different sort of varieties of anger that we can experience, feel, communicate when we're in a shared situation. Of course, when we're reading, if it's a character in a storybook that we want to consider might be angry, we have to choose our words carefully. What words might we use to communicate angry in these cases? Scowl, frown, grimace, growl, rage? My prediction was that these words should be rare in conversational language. They're not really needed in conversations because we can see if someone's scowling. Where they should come into the child's repertoire, into the child's statistics, is when they read or when they're read to. So this is a hypothesis developed and explored with Rainey Dong, who was a graduate student here. And she did a little bit like Nikki's studies with the picture book corpus that I mentioned earlier. She used that methodology, but looking particularly at these emotional words. So I'm going to speed up because I'm quickly running out of time. This figure works in exactly the same way. And this is showing data from children's picture books, from child-directed speech, just like before. And then in the red line, we've got the subtitles that have been scraped from the BBC, CBBS narratives. So this is narrative language. They're scripted TV programmes to some extent. And perhaps not surprisingly, the frequency and diversity of those emotion words sits somewhere in between books and conversations. Books have the most words, conversations have the least words, and somewhere in the middle is TV language. Similarly, for older children, here we move from CBBS to CBC, CBBC, and we see the same pattern. There's more words in the kids' reading books than there are, more emotion words than there are in the children's TV programmes. So children's books contain more emotion words and more different emotion words than child-directed speech or TV language. So what this tells us then, that children who are reading, once again, if they're reading or being read to, they're experiencing types of language that are quantitatively different and qualitatively different. And in some of our current work and looking to future directions, I'm really keen to think about what this means for social and emotional development more broadly. It seems to me the language that we have in story, the language that we have in written storybooks, is really the type of language that really characterises and shapes psychological states. Emotion words, abstract words, complex words, that sort of syntax where we think about what we felt yesterday, how we might feel tomorrow, it's difficult syntax and it's much more common in books than in conversations. Figurative language, embodied metaphor, and this whole ability to use language to persuade, to create, to regulate, these are things that feel very psychological to me. And again, thinking about children who are not reading or being read to, are they missing out on some of this language? Now, again, we're in this correlation, causation, association type mode here. An easy way of thinking about this would be to say we have these psychological states and all the language is doing is describing them or communicating them to another person. And surely there has to be something in there. I'm not saying, absolutely not saying that you have to be highly literate in order to feel. That would be a crazy thing to say. Equally, though, I think we can take this driver and vehicle type analogy and apply it here. And maybe something about the language that children experience through reading or being read to is doing something to shape, to nuance, to differentiate, to give synonyms to create varieties of emotion that children are not just using to label, but maybe are using to help understand emotion, their own emotions, and indeed other people's. And likely, with many things in life, it's probably going to be a little bit of both. So the hypothesis would be then storybooks showcase aspects of language that are critical for empathy. That seems uncontroversial. Possible links to well-being and mental health, as hinted at by the Story Museum video. But I think those direct links need to be forged, and causal connections definitely need to be made and understood. So that was my little summary of uses of literacy, introducing the idea of book language. I didn't talk about using that for sort of proper thinking, difficult thinking, but hopefully that case can be easy to follow. But this was just a little introduction to thinking about book language for thinking and for feeling in terms of kids' development. So let me close then with the afterword. And I'll go back here to those statistics that I mentioned early. Reading at 7 years of age is such a good predictor of life outcomes for complicated reason. Reading correlates with lots of things. Let's go back to that 20%. 20% of kids who leave school with inadequate levels of written language skill. It doesn't have to be this way. There is absolutely no reason why 20% of kids, those 20%, can't leave school with higher levels of reading than that. We know reading instruction works. This is a societal issue. It's related to systemic factors like poverty, for example. And these are things that could be dealt with should governments choose to do that. This takes us to the National Year of Reading initiative, partly driven by the government and partly by some of the great charities like the National Literacy Trust and Book Trust. And what they're trying to do is to bring a year of visualness, highlighting across the year the importance of reading and why we need to take it seriously and get everybody reading. In college, we're doing our own initiatives. So Denise, Dan and Shannon are doing a fabulous job in the comms and communications team, engagement team. If you haven't seen some of these wonderful videos where people talk about their favourite books, do check them out. You'll be writing things down for your reading list, and also some surprising choices by some of our colleagues. We've also got the Literary Festival, the Community Literary Festival coming up, bank holiday weekend. Get that in your calendars. It looks to be like it's going to be a really great event. So again, thank you to Denise and team for putting that together. But I'm also keen for the year of reading in college to have some sort of scholarly and academic opportunities for discussion and thought. That's obviously what we're about. So I'm just going to leave you with those to discuss and ponder when we go and refine our wine tasting over drinks. And to me, some of the themes of the year of reading that I think are worthy of further discussion boil down to two types of argument, which are interrelated but sort of different. One is the reading for pleasure agenda. This has been all over the news. If you have a podcast feed that's anything like mine, these are popping up all the time, all over the national newspapers, and indeed in government reports that we will need to get kids reading for pleasure. Now, I don't disagree with this, but I do disagree with it as well at the same time. In that reading for pleasure to me seems to be an outcome variable. We take pleasure in things that we can do. It's not pleasurable if we can't do it. And this to me has got the unfortunate side effect perhaps of creating an extra struggle for those kids who are struggling anyway. Not only do you have to read, not only are you not very good at reading, you're meant to be enjoying it type argument, which is obviously not what we want. So yet at the same time, reading experience and engagement with text is really, really important. And what I would call for is thinking about finding time to read meaningful texts with children in an active way. That doesn't mean dressing up on World Book Day as Pippi Longstocking or something. That should be banned. It's great for preschoolers and young kids. Once kids are reading, they need time to read and to explore reading with a skilled reader, with an adult or a reading partner. If reading is broken, my supervisor tells me you fix reading. You don't stand on one leg, you don't take fish oil, you don't put on funny glasses, you don't dress up, you read. So that's my take on reading for pleasure. Related to reading pleasure is something that I guess gets a little bit closer to us as academic tutors, and in the college, this notion of the reading crisis, that young people are coming to university, all of us are not reading as much as we used to, and that this is affecting thinking, when we can no longer do it anymore. And again, we've been all over the headlines and various Substacks and podcasts and so on. And again, I feel, there's discussions and debates to be had there. This relates to social media use. It also relates to discussions about AI. And I guess my sort of take on this at the moment, again, it would be great to have more conversations across the year on this theme, is that story is not going anywhere. Story is the sort of biological engine to us. We create stories, we make up stories. Stories are at our heart. For several generations, stories have come via the written modality. Perhaps we're now in a way where we can get our story satiation from TikTok, from short-form videos. And for the reasons I've described in the lecture, the language of those things is going to be quite different because it's conversational language. We're there in the moment in the TikTok video. We haven't got the sustained effort. We haven't got the reading, extended reading over the time, the difficult reading. And that's something that maybe people are missing out on that might have consequences. And then if we pair it with AI that's coming along to take out all of the sort of low-level jobs, there might not be a need for much of the population to be high-level readers anymore. Maybe it just isn't going to be taught as much in the future, and we will move to a post-literate society, which, evolution happens, change happens. But the worry there, of course, is that that wouldn't be distributed evenly, and it would be the less advantaged kids who are not learning to read who are missing out. Being literate will once again return to how it was a few generations ago as the privilege of the few and not the many. Let us get us to the wine to reception now. So I'll finish just with a few more photographs. These were taken in college directed by Helen Norris, who's here today. And you might recognise some of the locations around the college and the joy of reading. I'm not a complete killjoy. I think there is pleasure in reading, but there's also effort that needs to be made. So thank you very much.